Unfortunately, the most jam-packed part of the histology lecture is the one we have least time for, so you're free to go if you have to go. The adrenal glands, which you will encounter in the abdomen, are flattened little organs perched on top of the poles of the kidneys, which are a fusion of the two different cell types, much like the pituitary gland is. So adrenal cortex occurs or originates from a big mass of fat or cholesterol in the fetus, which give rise to the gonads as well. Whereas the neural crest cells of the nervous system form your adrenal medulla. So somewhere along fetal development, they will fuse and form the adrenal glands as we know it. So right there on top of the kidneys. So the hormones will be discussed by your physiology professors. I'm just flashing them here. I will mention them in passing when we talk about the different layers of the adrenal cortex. So going from the outside, from the capsule of the gland itself, going downwards towards the medulla, you have three zones or histologic layers. The first is the part that looks like a kidney. So that's why they call it the zona glomerulosa. As you can, the clumping here differentiates it from the straightening out here in the next zone. So by location, they are zona glomerulosa and they look like a kidney glomerulus and form clusters, not irregular looking clusters. So in terms of cytology, their nuclei are round and they have less cytoplasm compared to the next zone. So that gives it a darker appearance in terms of the stain because there's less uh, cytoplasm. So a lot of smooth endoplasmic reticulum, which means it has to do with a lipid derived hormone and numerous mitochondria. So this is only in comparison with the next zone. They have less lipid droplets compared to the next zone. So that gives it its darker appearance despite being a very fatty based cell, cytology wise. So it produces aldosterone, which is also important from you from getting thirsting to death. Though it helps you to conserve salt, I mean sodium, and the water molecules that attach to the sodium ion. So that renin-angiotensin system, which the SARS-CoV-2 targets, is what controls your body's hydration status, hence the connection with the distal renal tubules of the kidneys. So that's the slide I showed you earlier. So the importance of the zona glomerulosa in terms of its hormone, aldosterone. So more on that with your physiology professors and internal medicine. So the zone of glomeruli looking things gives rise now to a straightening out of those cells into the zona fasciculata. So zona ziggy is zona glomerulosa over here. So zona fasciculata, you can imagine if these are clumps of spaghetti, here you straighten out the spaghetti noodles to form the zona fasciculata. And similar to what I taught you about the brain on cross-section, if you cut something longitudinally, it looks lighter. The same principle applies here. So the straightening out here of these single cell strands is your zona fasciculata. Since it has a lot more space, it has a lot more fat, it looks a lot chubbier. So the chubbiness of that cell gives it its name. So the name of those chubby looking cells are the spongiocytes. So spongiocytes form columns here. And for every column, there is a capillary. So it's a very richly supplied area in terms of blood supply. So here are your spongy cells, spongocytes. It's because they are fat, so they're chubby, and they are also clear looking because of the effects of the fixation and dehydration process of the slide preparation. So spongy and a lot of more mitochondria relatively to the ziggy layer above because they produce a lot of steroid derived hormones. So imagine them as a string of pearls because they are single cell thick layers or columns dropping down towards the adrenal medulla. So these produce your stress hormone, the glomerulocorticoid known as cortisol. So I'll mention cortisol again when we go back to the neuro part of OS202 in terms of the stress. So you produce this when you're stressed out. And imagine if you produce this on a daily basis, it is bad for you in terms of mental health. So aside from mental health, so it raises your blood sugar, especially if you're on the diabetic side or the diabetic tendency, because it is a stressful situation. Your immune system breaks down and you break down. Everything breaks down, even your proteins and your fats. And then you have weight loss as well and the loss of muscle mass. Okay, so Ziggy, the string of pearls, and the pearls that have dropped on the floor, which is your zona reticularis. So the zona reticularis is also easy because it's the last layer of the cortex of the adrenal gland, and it is again it's like you drop the pearls on the floor. So irregular branching cords and clusters, much like the zona glomerulosa, and of course the requisite blood supply. So while they were spongy up here and single cell thick here, they form clusters again. So since there's less fat, they become darker looking relatively compared to the zona glomerulosa cells. So that's why they have less cytoplasm, so they look darker than the the zone above. So they may contain the so-called lipofuscin pigment. So lipofuscin means fat and pink, fat pink, which becomes brown pigment. It's just a byproduct of its metabolism because of the hormones that they produce. This time, cholesterol derived, but have to do with the manliness of a person. So androgens, the so-called DHEA, dihydroepiandrosterone, androsterone, and the DHEAS, meaning there's additional sulfate attached, and the precursor of testosterone, which is androstenedione. So those are the products of the zona reticularis, and nothing to do with stress, but more to do with manliness, masculinity, if you want a better term. Okay. Next, the adrenal medulla. It is a modified neural and endocrine tissue and produces something relevant to the nervous system, which is your epinephrine and norepinephrine, much like your locus coeruleus does. So the domain of this epinephrine, norepinephrine is your fight or flight system, your sympathetic nervous system. So they are at the core of the adrenal medulla. So you zoom out first to see the innermost core of the organ, see a very large vein inside and a lot of capillaries. So that's the adrenal medulla, and they look bluish relatively compared to the adrenal cortex. Looking at them, you'll see familiar looking cells, which are actually neurons, which are modified. So the pale nuclei and the prominent nucleolus suggestive of a neuron inside the adrenal medulla, and other cells which are not neuron looking because they have dark nuclei here. So the cells which are neurons are actually the similar to postganglionic neurons, no, of the sympathetic nervous system. And these are the ones that produce your fight or flight hormones. This is a tumor of the adrenal medulla when you have too much of those nerve cells. This is a pheochromocytoma, which raises the blood pressure. So that's the effect of epinephrine. Norepinephrine needs to raise the blood pressure. Okay.